About 15 years ago, I was sitting in a grass hut in Thailand, talking to a young boy from Burma. The boy's name was Ong, and he told me that when he was 11 years old, he was walking on his way home from meeting his aunt when he ran into a soldier on the street. The soldier demanded to see his identity card. Ong said, "I'm 11, I don't have an ID card." The soldier said, "Doesn't matter. If you don't have an ID card, you have to go to prison for 5 years." That actually wasn't true, but Ong didn't know that. And then the soldier said, "If you don't want to go to prison, you can join the army instead." Well, Ong didn't want to do either, but he decided that the army probably sounded better than prison. So before he knew it, he was in a military training camp. He told me that his gun was taller than he was, and that when he couldn't keep up with the training exercises, he was beaten. Ong was only 12 when he was sent into combat for the first time. He told me that he was terrified, but he was also afraid that if he didn't shoot his gun, his commander was going to punish him. So he hid behind a tree and fired his gun in the air. He soon got used to combat, but when he was 13, he was out on patrol with his unit. They encountered a group of unarmed women and children, and they radioed back to headquarters saying, "What should we do?" The answer came back, "Kill them." Ong watched as his fellow soldiers lined up the women and children and shot them down. He said at that point he couldn't take it anymore, and even though he knew he could be shot for desertion, he fled across the border to Thailand. And that's where I met him. He was still only 14 years old. So when people find out that I work on human rights, and specifically abuses against children, the recruitment and use of child soldiers, the worst forms of child labor, kids in detention, they ask me, "Don't you get depressed? Don't you get discouraged?" And from reading the news, which tends to emphasize war and tragedy, it's easy to come to the conclusion that the situation for children around the world is only getting worse. But what I want to tell you today is that amazing progress is being made for kids every single day. And it's happening because of committed activists, including children themselves, who are organizing, who are speaking out, and who are demanding change from people in power. I want to tell you about 3 of these individuals. Najud is from Yemen, a poor country at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. Najud loved school. She loved playing marbles with her best friend. But her father struggled to find work and to support his family. One day when Najud came home from school, he had a startling announcement. He said, "Najud, you're going to be married." Najud was stunned. She was 9 years old. She soon found out that her future husband had offered a bride price of $750. This was more than her father was willing to turn down. Within just a few weeks, she was married to a man who was 30 years old, more than 3 times her age. The man had promised her father that he wouldn't touch her until puberty. But on their wedding night, he raped her. Najud begged her parents to let her come back home, but they refused. So one day, about 2 months after her wedding, she went by herself to the courthouse, and she found a judge who was willing to listen to her story. Child marriage is common in Yemen, but even the judge was shocked at how young Najud was. He helped her find a lawyer, and at age 10, she became probably the youngest divorcee in the world. Other girls were inspired by her story, and today she's part of a global movement that aims to end child marriage in a single generation. I also want to introduce you to Cherner Ba. Cherner is from Sierra Leone in West Africa. He was 12 when Sierra Leone's civil war came to his city. Suddenly, soldiers were everywhere. He could no longer go to the beach to play. His house was burned down, and he and his family were forced to flee. They spent 3 years in camps for refugees and displaced persons. When he was 15, the war was over, and he was able to come back home. Over 50,000 people had been killed, many schools had been destroyed, but there was a process underway to rebuild the country, and Cherner wanted to be part of it. He said to his friends, "Wouldn't it be great if our voices mattered?" He was able to get an appointment with the Minister of Social Welfare, and he went with his friends and they proposed a children's parliament. Well, she didn't take their idea very seriously, but she agreed to help them organize a children's forum. They brought together 50 kids from across the country, and they decided that their number one priority was free education. At the time in Sierra Leone, every kid, even going to public school, had to pay tuition. And Cherner himself had been kicked out several times when his parents didn't have enough money to keep up with his fees. Cherner traveled around the country starting children's clubs at 40 different schools. They started a national radio program and invited government officials to come on and talk about education and other policies. In the run-up to national elections, they drafted a children's manifesto calling for a complete abolition of all school fees, and they invited party leaders to sign on. Within 2 years, Sierra Leone adopted a law guaranteeing every child a free education. School enrollment doubled, and hundreds of thousands of children were able to go to school for the very first time. And the third person I want you to meet is Prakash Gujar. Prakash is from Rajasthan, which is in northwest India. He was only 5 when he was bonded into child labor. His father was poor, and out of desperation, he asked his landlord for a loan. It was about 15,000 rupees. That's about $250 US. In exchange, he promised that he and his son would work for the landlord. So every morning, instead of going to school, Prakash would get up, he'd go out and work in the fields. He got very little food, no wages, and said that he was beaten more times than he could count. When Prakash was 8, child labor activists came to his village, and they found out about his situation. They filed a complaint against the landlord and won his freedom. They took him to a rehabilitation center where he was able to go to school for the first time. But when Prakash would go back to his village, he saw other children working, and he knew that he wanted to do something about this problem. When he heard about a child labor conference in Delhi, he rode his bicycle for 36 hours to get there. And he joined with the activists who had freed him to establish child-friendly villages. These are villages where everyone agrees that no child is working, every child is in school, and children have a voice in community decisions. They went from village to village, talking with officials, elders, children themselves, and within a few years, had 350 villages that were child labor-free. Today, Prakash runs a school of his own. Now, stories like this are happening all over the world, and they're happening because of committed activists like these folks. And over the last few decades, we've learned a lot about how we can transform the lives of children. We've learned at least 3 key lessons. The first, education. Education is transformative. A child who's in school is much less likely to be recruited as a soldier, to end up in child labor, to marry young, or commit a criminal offense. Every additional year that a child stays in school is likely to raise their eventual earnings by 10%. To educate every child in the world through the end of high school would cost an additional $39 billion. That's actually less than what Americans spend every year on soda. Education is one of the smartest investments that we can make. The second lesson is accountability. Abuse and exploitation of children continue when perpetrators face no consequences. When I first went to Burma to investigate the recruitment and use of child soldiers, recruiters faced no penalties. In fact, they were rewarded for every new recruit, regardless of age. But after my organization shone a spotlight on what was happening and generated international pressure, the government of Burma made a commitment to end their use of child soldiers. They released hundreds of kids from their armed forces. For the first time, they started imposing penalties on child recruiters, and child recruitment went way down. Third is activism. Change doesn't happen by itself. We have to insist on it. Unfortunately, many governments will do nothing unless they're pushed. But today, there are thousands of organizations around the world that are working on behalf of kids. A global movement called Girls, Not Brides, has convinced all of the world's governments to set a goal that by 2030, they will end child marriage. In over 100 countries, there are organizations that are working to ensure the right of every child to attend school. So what have been the results of all these efforts? Well, compared to 25 years ago, a child who's born today is twice as likely to make it to their 5th birthday. Since the year 2000, the number of children in school has increased by 110 million. During the same period of time, child labor rates have dropped by 30%. That's 78 million fewer children exploited for their labor. The number of countries where child soldiers are fighting has dropped by 1/3. And girls today are 1/3 less likely to be subjected to female genital mutilation than a generation ago. Across Africa, there are 8,000 villages that have pledged to end child marriage. Now, to be sure, there are still millions of children who are out of school, who are engaged in child labor. Too many are recruited as soldiers or marry young. But we've made amazing progress. And more importantly, we can make a lot more. I wish I could tell you what happened to Ong, that boy I met in Burma so many years ago. It could be that he stayed in Thailand and worked illegally. Maybe he was eventually able to go back home and reunite with his family. Unfortunately, I will probably never know. But what I can tell you is that since I met that boy, over 100,000 former child soldiers have been released from armed groups and forces around the world. And in some countries, the use of child soldiers has ended entirely. So when people ask me, do I get depressed? Do I get discouraged? The answer is, sure, sometimes. But mostly I'm encouraged by the successes we've had, by our potential, by the brave people like Prakash, Cherner, and Najud. And I believe that everything that we do for children and to protect their rights is worth it. Thank you.